The 999 operator's voice was calm, reassuring. "Stay in your flat, Catherine. Close the door. The fire brigade is on the way. You're safer where you are." Catherine Hickman, 31 years old, fashion designer, was in flat 79 on the 13th floor. Smoke was coming into her flat. She could hear it in her voice. The fear. The struggle to breathe. She stayed on the line for 40 minutes. Following instructions. Doing what she was told. At the end of the call, the operator could no longer hear her breathing. 4 floors below, in flat 121 on the 11th floor, Helena Doarker had fled there with her 20-day-old daughter Michelle. Seeking safety with her friend Diana Francisquini and Diana's 2 children. 6-year-old Thais. 3-year-old Felipe. 5 people crowded into one flat. All told the same thing. Stay put. Help is coming. The smoke found them anyway. By the time firefighters reached them, all 6 were dead. Not burned. Suffocated. Killed by toxic smoke that should never have reached them. In a building that had just been refurbished. In flats where the council promised they'd be safe. This is the story of how Southwark Council spent millions making Lakanal House look modern. And in the process, turned it into a death trap. Lakanal House stood 14 stories above Camberwell, inner London. A product of post-war rebuilding when councils erected high-rise blocks across the capital to house families displaced by German bombs. Southwark Council owned the tower. Managed it. Maintained it. Or at least, they were supposed to. The building had been refurbished between 2006 and 2007. Millions of pounds spent on improvements. New facade wrapped around the exterior. Aluminium composite cladding installed to improve insulation. Security doors fitted throughout to reduce crime in estate walkways. Fresh mineral fibreboard lining the walls. Suspended ceilings with plyboard and melamine covering. Metal-framed windows. The works. What they didn't upgrade? The fire safety systems. The compartmentalization. The proper sealing around service cuttings. Those cost money too. But we'll come back to that. And when we do, you'll see exactly how council budget cuts turned a contained electrical fire into a catastrophe that would echo 8 years later at Grenfell Tower. The tower was divided into paired maisonettes, council housing units stacked vertically through the building's 14 floors. Each pair shared communal corridors that ran the length of the structure. A communal staircase and lift provided access. The design was typical of its era. Reinforced concrete crosswalls provided structural support. 4.5-inch thick floor and roof slabs separated units vertically. Timber staircases inside individual flats connected upper and lower levels of the maisonettes. Flat 43 sat on the 9th floor. Home to Helena Doarker, 34 years old, and her baby daughter Michelle. The baby was just 20 days old on the afternoon of July 3, 2009. Just after 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 16:20 hours, an electrical fault in a portable television in their living room began to smolder. Not a dramatic explosion. Not flames shooting across the room. Just heat. Smoke. The slow, patient accumulation of combustible materials reaching ignition temperature. Helen was in another room. Michelle in her cot. The television continued to burn. By 4:30, the fire had spread through the living room. Flames were climbing the walls. Dark thick smoke filled the maisonette. But here's what should have happened, what the building's designers promised would happen. The fire should have stayed contained within flat 43. That's the entire principle of compartmentalization. Each unit acts as a sealed box. Fire-resistant walls. Fire-resistant doors. Proper sealing around every pipe, every cable, every service cutting that penetrated those walls. The fire stays in one box. Everyone else stays safe. The fire brigade arrives, puts it out, disaster averted. That's not what happened at Lakanal House. The smoke didn't stay in flat 43. It poured into the communal corridors through gaps that should never have existed. Improper sealing around service cuttings meant smoke could travel freely between units. The front doors were fire-resistant, yes, but they weren't smoke-sealed. Worse, the security doors installed during refurbishment had vents in them. Vents in communal doors. Holes deliberately cut into the very barriers meant to stop smoke spreading. The toxic and suffocating smoke found those vents. Poured through them. Filled the corridors. Then it found the timber frame with asbestos panel arrangement in the walls. More gaps. More pathways. The smoke began entering flats on floors above and below flat 43. The first 999 call came at 4:20. 59 Scow Gardens. Lakanal House. Fire in a high-rise block. Smoke visible from multiple floors. Appliances dispatched immediately. The London Fire Brigade's control room began receiving more calls. Residents trapped. Smoke filling corridors. People at windows. The dispatcher followed protocol. The controversial stay-put policy. Based on the assumption that compartmentalization works. That fires stay contained in single units. That residents are safer staying in their flats than attempting to escape through smoke-filled corridors. Multiple callers were advised to stay put. Close your doors. Seal the gaps with wet towels. Help is coming. Stay where you are. But the compartmentalization had already failed. And nobody at the control room knew it yet. First appliances arrived within minutes. Fire crews faced immediate problems. The emergency access lift was out of action. Crews would have to carry breathing apparatus and equipment up 14 floors via the communal staircase. Smoke was already filling the stairwell. Counting floors became difficult. Visibility reduced to meters. Watch Commander Paul Jennings led the first crew into the building. He later testified at the coroner's inquest. When we entered the stairwell, the smoke was already heavy. By the time we reached the 9th floor, we were in zero visibility. The heat was intense. We could hear the fire, but we had to locate it by feel. The layout was complex. Multiple doors. Internal passageways. Dwarf doors between rooms that we had to navigate blind. We found flat 43 and began fighting the fire, but we were getting reports that smoke was affecting floors above and below. That shouldn't happen. That tells you compartmentalization has failed. But the fire wasn't finished. The flames had found the building's second fatal weakness. The new facade. The aluminium composite cladding wrapped around the exterior during refurbishment. Combustible cladding. Nobody had properly assessed its fire performance. Nobody had questioned whether wrapping a residential tower in combustible materials might be, perhaps, a spectacularly terrible idea. The fire spread via facade. External fire spread. Flames climbed the outside of the building faster than firefighters could move inside. A draft between the building and cladding acted like a chimney, drawing flames upward. Molten cladding dripping down. Igniting materials below. Vertical fire spread. Lateral fire spread. The fire moved in directions it should never have been able to move, breaking every assumption the stay-put policy was built on. Firefighter Martin Crudace was part of the second crew entering the building. He described the scene to investigators. We could see flames on the outside of the building, climbing up the facade. That's not normal. Fire shouldn't be able to do that. When we got inside, we found smoke on floors where there was no internal fire. The smoke was coming from outside, through windows, through gaps in the cladding. The building was acting like one big chimney and we were trying to fight a fire in the middle of it. Subscribe if you want to see more stories about the disasters that happened because someone, somewhere, decided that saving money was more important than saving lives. Flat 121 on the 11th floor. Home to Diana Francisquini, 26 years old, and her 2 children. 6-year-old Thais. 3-year-old Felipe. Brazilian nationals. Diana had moved to London years earlier looking for better opportunities. Working as a cleaner. Raising her children alone in a foreign country. When the smoke began filling the corridors, Helena Doarca from the 9th floor fled upward with baby Michelle. Seeking safety. Seeking help. She made it to Diana's flat. 5 people now inside. 2 adults. 3 children, including a 20-day-old baby. Diana called 999. The recording was played at the inquest. Her voice, increasingly desperate. Speaking in accented English. Smoke coming under the door. Can't breathe. Please help us. My children. Please. The baby. The dispatcher, following protocol, advised her to stay put. Close the door. Seal the gaps. Firefighters are in the building. They're coming to you. Just stay where you are. But the firefighters were still fighting the original fire on the 9th floor. And the smoke was already filling flat 121 through the same gaps, the same failures of compartmentalization that had doomed the entire building. A neighbor heard sounds from the flat. Crying. Calling for help. But the smoke was too thick in the corridor. The neighbor escaped down the stairs with their own family. There was nothing else they could do. Diana Francisquini, 26. Thais Francisquini, 6. Felipe Francisquini, 3. Helena Doarca, 34. Michelle Doarca, 20 days old. All 5 died together in flat 121. Killed by toxic smoke that should never have reached them. The smoke didn't travel through the building logically. It traveled through the paths of least resistance. Through every gap in the fire-resistant coating. Through every improperly sealed service cutting. Through vents that should never have been installed in communal doors. The fire brigade would later describe the smoke movement as chaotic. Unpredictable. Appearing on floors seemingly at random. Flat 79. 13th floor. Home to Catherine Hickman, 31 years old. Fashion designer. She called 999. Reported smoke entering her flat. Was advised to stay put. The call handler maintained contact with Catherine for 40 minutes. The longest call of the incident. 40 minutes of reassurance. 40 minutes of following procedure. 40 minutes of believing help would arrive in time. The recording captures Catherine's voice changing. At first, worried but controlled. Then struggling. Coughing. The dispatcher kept talking. Kept reassuring. Stay by the window. Fresh air. Crews are searching the building. They'll find you. At the end of the call, the dispatcher could no longer hear Catherine breathing. She stopped responding. The line stayed open. Silence. The firefighters were still fighting their way upward. Breathing apparatus running low. Crews rotating. Fresh teams coming up as exhausted crews came down. But there were too many floors. Too much smoke. Too many people calling for help. Firefighter James Murray was part of the team that reached the 13th floor. We found her in flat 79. The fire hadn't reached her flat. No flames. No heat damage. Just smoke. Thick, black, toxic smoke. She'd done everything right. Stayed on the phone. Followed instructions. Waited for us like she was told. But the smoke followed her. Through gaps around the door. Through vents. Through the suspended ceilings and false ceilings that created hidden pathways through the building. She never had a chance. Catherine died alone in her flat. The smoke had traveled up through the external fire spread. Through the gaps in the facade. Found ways into her flat that the building's designers never anticipated. Because they never tested the combustible cladding. Never checked the ceiling. Never verified that the refurbishment they'd spent millions on hadn't actually made the building less safe. By 6 o'clock in the evening, over 60 appliances were in attendance. Fire engines lined Scow Gardens. Crews searching every floor. Trying to reach everyone who'd been told to stay put. Finding bodies in flats that looked untouched by fire. No flames. No heat damage. Just smoke. And 6 people dead. The BBC reported that evening, breaking news from Camberwell. 6 people confirmed dead in a tower block fire in South London. London Fire Brigade has declared it a major incident. Over 60 fire engines on scene. Residents evacuated. Investigation underway into how a fire in a single flat spread to multiple floors. Sky News showed aerial footage. The blackened exterior of Lakanal House. Windows blown out on multiple floors. The aluminium composite cladding melted and charred. Smoke still rising from the structure. 3 adults. 3 children. The youngest just 20 days old. The fire was brought under control by early evening. But the questions were just beginning. How does a television fire in a single flat kill 6 people across multiple floors? How does smoke spread to units where residents were told they'd be safe? How does a recently refurbished building fail so catastrophically? The initial investigation treated it as suspicious. That's standard procedure for any fire with multiple fatalities. Police sealed the building. Forensic teams moved in. But investigators quickly established the cause. Electrical fault in the portable television. No arson. No criminal intent. Just an appliance failure. Which made everything worse. Because it meant the building itself had killed these people. Its design. Its refurbishment. Its multiple, cascading failures. Fire investigator David Hallowell examined the remains of the television. The fault was in the capacitor circuit. A component failure that caused overheating. It's the kind of failure that happens in homes every day. Usually, it causes a small fire. Smoke detector goes off. Resident wakes up. Calls fire brigade. Fire contained to one room. Nobody dies. But at Lakanal House, A routine electrical fault became a mass casualty event because every safety system that should have worked didn't. The coroner's inquest began in January 2013. 3.5 years after the fire. The Emerging Issues report identified so many failures that investigators struggled to know where to start. Compartmentalization failure topped the list. The reinforced concrete crosswalls were sound. The 4.5-inch thick floor and roof slabs were adequate. But everything else? Catastrophic. The fire-resistant coating around service cuttings? Inconsistent application. Some pipes properly sealed. Others with gaps wide enough to push your hand through. The report found no evidence that anyone had checked this work. No inspections. No verification. Fire safety consultant Arnold Tarling examined the service cuttings. He testified at the inquest. I found pipes passing through fire-resistant walls with no sealing whatsoever. Just holes. Gaps of 50, 75, even 100 millimeters around some pipes. Any first-year apprentice knows you seal those gaps. It's basic fire safety. The fact that this refurbishment was completed and signed off with these gaps tells me nobody was checking the work. Nobody cared. The front doors? Fire resistant, yes. Rated for 30 minutes. But not smoke sealed. Smoke doesn't care about fire ratings. Smoke finds any gap. Any crack. And these doors had plenty. Building Inspector Colin Todd examined the door assemblies. The doors themselves met fire-resistant standards. But the frames weren't properly sealed. There were gaps of up to 10 millimeters in some locations. Smoke will travel through a 1 millimeter gap. 10 millimeters is a highway. And that's before we even discuss the vents. The vents in the communal doors, installed during refurbishment to improve airflow. Nobody questioned whether vents in fire doors might be counterproductive. The vents were aiding fire spread, creating pathways for smoke to move freely through the building. Southwark Council's own internal documents showed that fire safety officers had raised concerns about the vents. In 2007, 2 years before the fire, a memo was circulated. Subject line: Security door vents and fire safety. The memo stated clearly, installing vents in fire doors compromises their effectiveness. Recommend removal or alternative ventilation solution. The memo was filed. No action taken. The suspended ceilings and false ceilings installed throughout during refurbishment, creating hidden voids above each maisonette. Voids that weren't properly fire stopped. More pathways for smoke. More ways for fire to spread. Structural engineer Rebecca Walsh conducted a detailed analysis of the ceiling voids. These voids ran the entire length of the maisonettes. In some cases, they connected to voids in adjacent units. The fire stopping was minimal or non-existent. Smoke could travel laterally through these voids, emerge in different flats. The residents had no idea there were hidden spaces above them connecting them to their neighbors. Spaces filled with combustible materials. The plyboard with melamine covering. Combustible materials. Installed in a residential tower. Nobody had considered fire performance. Just appearance and cost. The oil-based coverings on various surfaces. More combustible materials. More fuel for the fire. The mineral fibreboard used throughout. Some types are fire resistant. But testing revealed that the specific type used at Lakanal House had limited fire resistance. And it was installed in ways that created more gaps. More pathways for smoke. And then there was the cladding. The aluminium composite cladding. The new facade that was supposed to make the building more energy efficient, more attractive, more modern. It was combustible. Highly combustible. And nobody had properly tested it. Nobody had considered what would happen if a fire reached the exterior. The draft between the building and cladding created a chimney effect, drawing flames upward, creating external fire spread that bypassed all the internal fire safety measures. Professor Jose Terrero, a fire safety engineering expert, examined the cladding system. The aluminium composite panels had a polyethylene core. Polyethylene is essentially plastic. It's highly combustible. When it burns, it produces toxic smoke and it melts. We found evidence of molten cladding dripping down the facade. This molten material was igniting materials below, creating multiple fire points. The cavity between the cladding and the original building wall created a perfect chimney. Hot gases rising, drawing fresh air from below, accelerating the fire spread. This is textbook dangerous design. The inquest heard testimony from fire safety experts, from building inspectors, from council officials. The picture that emerged was damning. Southwark Council was responsible for fire safety checks. They had a legal duty to maintain fire safety standards, to inspect, to verify, to ensure residents were safe. They had made no checks. None. The refurbishment had been completed without proper fire safety oversight. Work that should have been inspected wasn't. Problems that should have been caught weren't. The council's own policies had been ignored. Former fire safety officer Michael Wright had worked for Southwark Council from 2004 to 2008. He testified, "I raised concerns about the refurbishment work in 2006. I documented problems with fire stopping, with gaps in fire-resistant barriers, with combustible materials being installed. My reports were filed. Nothing was done. I raised the issues again in 2007. Again in 2008. Each time I was told there was no budget for remedial work. The council knew about the problems. They chose not to fix them. Let that sink in for a moment. The council knew. They documented the problems. They had written reports detailing the failures. And they decided that fixing them wasn't worth the money." Council housing manager Patricia Evans testified about budget pressures. "We had limited resources. Hundreds of properties to maintain. We had to prioritize. The refurbishment of Lakanal House was already over budget. Going back to fix fire safety issues would have cost hundreds of thousands of pounds. We made the assessment that the building was safe enough for continued occupation." Safe enough. What an interesting phrase. Not actually safe. Just safe enough. The coroner pressed her on this. Who made that assessment? What qualifications did they have? What fire safety expertise informed that decision? Evans couldn't answer. The decision had been made at a management level. No formal risk assessment. No fire safety engineer consulted. Just a budget meeting where someone decided that spending money on fire safety wasn't justified. The controversial stay-put policy became a major focus. The policy itself wasn't wrong. In a properly compartmentalized building, staying put is the safest option. But Lakanal House wasn't properly compartmentalized. The policy depended on assumptions that weren't true. Fire brigade officials testified that they had no way of knowing compartmentalization had failed until they were inside the building. The complex layout made assessment difficult. Smoke appearing on multiple floors. Some flats affected. Others not. The pattern made no sense until they understood the extent of the failures. Assistant Commissioner Steve Turek defended the stay-put advice. Our procedures are based on the fundamental principle of compartmentalization. If a building is properly constructed, staying in your flat with the door closed is safer than attempting to evacuate through smoke-filled corridors. The problem at Lakanal House wasn't our procedure. The problem was that the building didn't work the way it was supposed to. The compartmentalization had failed catastrophically. But we had no way of knowing that from the initial calls. The question became, should the stay-put policy have been abandoned earlier? Should dispatchers have told people to evacuate? But evacuating into smoke-filled corridors carried its own risks. The reduced oxygen levels. The toxic smoke. People could die on the stairs just as easily as in their flats. Fire survival guidance expert Sarah Harrison testified. Once compartmentalization fails, there are no good options. Stay put and you risk being overcome by smoke entering your flat. Evacuate and you risk being overcome by smoke in the corridors. The only real solution is buildings that don't fail in the first place. Buildings where compartmentalization actually works. It was an impossible situation created by failures that should never have existed. The coroner's verdict, delivered in March 2013, pulled no punches. 6 people died. Catherine Hickman, 31. Diana Francisquini, 26. Thais Francisquini, 6. Felipe Francisquini, 3. Helen Adoaka, 34. Michelle Adoaka, 20 days old. All unlawfully killed. Unlawfully killed. Not accidental death. Not misadventure. Unlawfully killed. Because the failures that caused their deaths were the result of criminal negligence. The coroner identified breaches to health and safety regulations. Management and maintenance failures. Systemic problems throughout Southwark Council's handling of the building. The coroner made specific recommendations. Review fire safety in all similar tower blocks. Ban combustible cladding on high-rise residential buildings. Improve compartmentalization checks. Reform the stay-put policy guidance. Ensure councils actually conduct the fire safety inspections they're legally required to conduct. These recommendations were published in 2013. 4 years before Grenfell Tower. Now here's the part that should make you angry. Some of those recommendations were implemented. Some weren't. The review of similar tower blocks found problems in dozens of buildings. Some were fixed. Many weren't. Budget constraints, you understand. Priorities elsewhere. The recommendation to ban combustible cladding. Discussed. Debated. Studied. Not implemented. The building industry lobbied against it. Too expensive to retrofit existing buildings. Too restrictive for new construction. The government compromised. Issued guidance. Suggestions. Not requirements. Just weeks after the Lakanal House fire, in July 2009, senior government official Brian Martin shut down the investigation. He sent an email to the building research establishment. For the purposes of the fire investigation contract you have with the department, I'm satisfied that there will be no need for you to revisit Lakanal House. Any further visits will need to be funded by a third party. He shut it down. less than a month after 6 people died. Before crucial questions about fire spread had been answered. He later testified at the Grenfell inquiry that he didn't think the Lakanal House fire was severe enough to justify investigating other buildings. Not severe enough. 6 people dead. Not severe enough. 4 years later, Grenfell Tower burned. 72 people died. The fire spread via facade. Aluminium composite cladding. Combustible materials. External fire spread. Vertical fire spread. The draft between building and cladding. Molten cladding dripping. Every single factor that killed 6 people at Lakanal House. Except at Grenfell, there were 72 victims instead of 6. The Grenfell inquiry specifically referenced Lakanal House. Noted that the lessons had not been learned. That the recommendations had not been fully implemented. That the same failures, the same negligence, the same prioritization of cost over safety, had killed again. Grenfell inquiry chairman Sir Martin Moore-Bick stated in his report, the Lakanal House fire provided clear warnings about the dangers of combustible cladding, inadequate compartmentalization, and failures in fire safety oversight. Those warnings were not heeded. Had the recommendations from the Lakanal House inquest been implemented, the Grenfell Tower fire might have been prevented. This represents a catastrophic failure of government, local authorities, and the construction industry to protect residents. After Grenfell, things moved faster. Combustible cladding banned. Inspections mandated. Billions spent on remediation. But it took 72 more deaths to force action on recommendations that had been sitting on desks since 2013. How many tower blocks in Britain still have combustible cladding? How many have the same compartmentalization failures? How many councils are still prioritizing budgets over safety? The official answer changes depending on who you ask and when you ask them. As of 2024, 15 years after Lakanal House, buildings are still being found with dangerous cladding. Still being evacuated. Residents still fighting to get their homes fixed. Still waiting for someone to take responsibility. Lakanal House was demolished in 2015. The demolition schedule moved faster than the remediation schedules for similar buildings still housing families. It was easier to tear it down than to explain why it had been allowed to fail. The demolition took months. Crews stripped the building floor by floor. The burned cladding. The melted windows. The smoke-stained walls. All the evidence of failure removed. Reduced to rubble. The site cleared. But demolishing the building didn't demolish the questions. Didn't demolish the anger of the families. Didn't demolish the knowledge that 6 people died preventably. No criminal charges were ever filed for the Lakanal House deaths. The Crown Prosecution Service reviewed the evidence in 2012. Decided there wasn't sufficient basis for corporate manslaughter charges. Not enough proof that specific individuals knew the building was dangerous and did nothing. Even though fire safety officers had documented the problems. Even though reports had been filed. Even though the council had been warned repeatedly. Apparently, institutional negligence doesn't count as criminal if it's sufficiently bureaucratic. Renee Barclay, Principal Crown Advocate for the CPS Special Crime Division, stated, "I am satisfied that, in accordance with the principles set out in the Code for Crown Prosecutors, there is no realistic prospect of conviction for an offence of manslaughter by gross negligence or corporate manslaughter against any individual, any company, or the London Borough of Southwark." The families were devastated. 3 years of waiting. 3 years of hoping for justice. And the answer was no prosecution. Southwark Council did eventually plead guilty to 4 breaches of fire safety regulations. In February 2017, at Southwark Crown Court, the council was fined £270,000. Ordered to pay £300,000 in prosecution costs. Total penalty, £570,000. The 4 specific breaches: failing to conduct a fire risk assessment, neglecting to review assessments after refurbishment, inadequate evaluation of risks from external fire spread, insufficient inspection of fire doors and escape routes. £570,000. For 6 lives. Less than £100,000 per victim. That's what Southwark Council paid for killing Catherine Hickman, Diana Francisquini, Thais Francisquini, Felipe Francisquini, Helena Doarca, and Michelle Doarca. The families received compensation through civil settlements. Money. As if money could replace a 20-day-old baby. As if it could bring back a 3-year-old boy. A 6-year-old girl. The amounts were never publicly disclosed. Standard practice in settlements. Confidentiality agreements. Everyone moves on. Except the families don't get to move on. And the problems that killed their loved ones keep killing other people. Subscribe if these patterns of institutional negligence and preventable deaths matter to you. Because the story repeats. Warnings ignored. Costs prioritized over safety. Lessons not learned. Until enough people die that ignoring the problem becomes politically impossible. The technical investigation into Lakanal House revealed fascinating and horrifying details about how fires behave in poorly compartmentalized buildings. The smoke movement patterns were studied extensively. Researchers traced how smoke traveled from flat 43 to flats on other floors. The primary pathway was through the service cuttings. Pipes and cables that ran vertically through the building. Each one should have been properly fire-stopped where it penetrated floors. Many weren't. Smoke followed these vertical channels, rising and falling through the building. The secondary pathway was through the facade. The combustible cladding didn't just burn. It created a conduit for smoke and flames to travel up the outside of the building. Then penetrate back inside through windows. Through gaps around the metal-framed windows. Through any opening in the new facade. The tertiary pathway was through the voids created by the suspended ceilings. Smoke from flat 43 entered the ceiling void. Traveled laterally. Found gaps in the fire stopping between units. Emerged in other flats. In a properly compartmentalized building, none of these pathways should exist. Each flat should be a sealed box. Smoke from one flat can't reach another. But at Lakanal House, the flats weren't sealed. They were connected by a network of gaps and voids and failures that turned the entire building into one big chimney. Fire investigators calculated that smoke reached the upper floors within 15 to 20 minutes of the fire becoming established in flat 43. 15 to 20 minutes. To travel multiple floors vertically through pathways that shouldn't have existed. The timber staircases inside individual maisonettes created additional complications. When fire spread within a maisonette, it could use those internal stairs to move between the lower and upper levels of the unit. This is normal. Expected. But it contributed to the confusing picture firefighters faced. Smoke and flames appearing at different levels, making it difficult to locate the seat of the fire. The dwarf doors and internal passageways in the complex layout of the maisonettes further complicated firefighting efforts. Crews had to navigate through multiple rooms to reach all areas. Visibility was zero. Heat was intense. The breathing apparatus gave them limited time. One firefighter described it as fighting blind in a maze. The emergency access lift failure meant every piece of equipment had to be carried up the stairs. Hoses. Breathing apparatus. Tools. Fresh crews. Victims. Everything. The communal staircase became a highway of exhausted firefighters going up and down in smoke and darkness. Watch Commander Jennings testified about the physical toll. We were carrying 30 kilograms of equipment each. Up 14 floors. In smoke. In heat. By the time you reach the fire floor, you're already exhausted. Then you have to fight the fire. Then you have to search. Then you have to get out before your air runs out. We were rotating crews every 20 minutes. Some men made multiple trips up those stairs. I don't know how they did it. The breathing apparatus was vital. The toxic smoke contained carbon monoxide, hydrogen cyanide, and dozens of other poisonous compounds. The combustible materials in the refurbishment, the plyboard, the melamine, the oil-based coverings, they all produced toxic gases when they burned. 1 or 2 breaths without breathing apparatus could render you unconscious. But breathing apparatus has limitations. Each set gives you about 30 to 40 minutes of air. Less if you're working hard. And firefighters carrying equipment up 14 floors and then fighting fires are definitely working hard. Some crews ran out of air while still inside the building. Had to make emergency exits. Guided out by crews coming in. The operation required massive coordination. Counting floors became critical. When you're in a smoke-filled stairwell with zero visibility, you need to know exactly which floor you're on. Miss a floor and you might be fighting fire on the wrong level while victims die on another. Crews used a system of checks. Count the landings. Feel for the floor numbers on the walls. Mark floors with tape or equipment as waypoints. But it was slow. Methodical. While people were dying. The appliances in attendance eventually numbered over 80. 18 fire engines directly involved in firefighting operations. Additional specialized units. Aerial platforms. Command vehicles. Press arrived. Television crews filming the smoke and flames. Around 150 residents were evacuated or rescued from the building. Many taken to nearby Welton Hall. Others to hospitals. 20 people suffered injuries, mostly smoke inhalation. And 6 never made it out alive. Residents who'd escaped stood in the street watching their home burn. Waiting for news. Hoping everyone else got out. Realizing, as the hours passed, that not everyone did. The coroner's inquest examined the stay-put advice in detail. Multiple witnesses testified. Fire brigade control room operators. Incident commanders. Fire safety experts. The consensus was this. The stay-put policy is correct for properly compartmentalized buildings. But once compartmentalization fails, the policy becomes deadly. The challenge is knowing when it has failed. At Lakanal House, the initial calls suggested a single flat involved. Standard procedure is stay put. By the time crews inside realized compartmentalization had failed, multiple flats were already affected. Changing the advice at that point might have sent people into smoke-filled corridors. Might have killed them on the stairs instead of in their flats. There's no good answer. The only good answer is buildings that work the way they're supposed to. Buildings where compartmentalization doesn't fail. Where stay put actually keeps people safe. The refurbishment cycle at Lakanal House was typical of council housing in inner London. Post-war buildings that needed updating. Limited budgets. Competing priorities. Councils trying to do more with less. But fire safety isn't an area where you can cut corners. It's not like delaying new carpets or putting off painting. Fire safety failures kill people. Quickly. Brutally. Without warning. The fire safety officer who'd repeatedly warned Southwark Council about problems testified emotionally at the inquest. I knew this would happen. I didn't know when. I didn't know which building. But I knew that if we didn't fix these problems, people would die. I put it in writing. Multiple times. I was ignored. And now 6 people are dead and I have to live with the fact that I documented exactly what would happen and nobody listened. Council officials testified that budget constraints made it impossible to address every issue immediately. That they had to prioritize. That they believed the building was safe enough. The investigation found similar failures in other tower blocks across Southwark. And in other boroughs. The Emerging Issues report identified dozens of buildings with combustible cladding. Hundreds with compartmentalization failures. Thousands with fire safety deficiencies. Some were fixed. Many weren't. After Grenfell, after 72 more deaths, the government finally mandated full inspections and remediation. 8 years after Lakanal House. 8 years of warnings ignored. The cost of fixing all the buildings with similar problems is estimated in the billions. Billions of pounds to correct deficiencies that should never have been allowed in the first place. Deficiencies that were documented. Reported. Flagged as dangerous. And ignored because fixing them would have cost money. So now it costs billions instead of millions. And 78 people are dead instead of 0. That's the arithmetic of negligence. The longer you ignore problems, the more expensive they become and the more people die. The families of the Lakanal House victims have been advocating for fire safety reform ever since. They attend Grenfell memorials. They speak at inquiries. They lobby politicians. Trying to ensure that their loved ones didn't die for nothing. Mbeta Doaka, husband of Helen and father of Michelle, spoke outside the inquest. We fear very much that lessons have not been learned and that it could happen again. My wife and my baby daughter died because the building was not safe. Because the council did not do its job. I don't want any other family to go through what we have been through. His fears were justified. 8 years later, Grenfell Tower proved him right. But meaningful reform is slow. The building industry resists regulation. Councils plead poverty. Politicians promise action and deliver committees. Meanwhile, people still live in tower blocks with combustible cladding. With compartmentalization failures. With all the same problems that killed 6 people at Lakanal House and 72 at Grenfell Tower. How many more will die before we actually learn these lessons? How many more inquests? How many more recommendations? How many more promises that this time we'll actually fix the problems? The mathematics are brutal. Every day a dangerous building remains occupied is another day the dice are rolled. Another electrical fault. Another kitchen fire. Another cigarette. Any spark can start the chain reaction that turns minor incident into mass casualty event. We know this. We've known this since Lakanal House. We've definitely known it since Grenfell Tower. And yet the buildings remain. The failures persist. The negligence continues. The victims of Lakanal House deserved better. Catherine Hickman deserved a building where staying put actually kept her safe. Diana Francisquini and her children deserved council housing that was actually safe. Helena Doarca deserved to raise her baby daughter. Michelle Doarca deserved a life. They didn't get what they deserved. They got a recently refurbished tower block that looked modern and safe. That had passed inspections it should never have passed. That met standards that were inadequate. That was maintained by a council that documented problems and then decided fixing them wasn't a priority. And when an electrical fault in a portable television created a routine fire that should have been contained in a single flat, the building failed. The compartmentalization failed. The smoke sealing failed. The cladding failed. Everything that was supposed to keep them safe failed. 6 people died in a building that killed them through accumulated negligence. Not dramatic negligence. Not obviously criminal negligence. Just the boring, bureaucratic, cost-conscious negligence of people who read reports about fire safety problems and decided that this year's budget couldn't accommodate the fixes. Maybe next year. Or the year after. Surely nothing will happen in the meantime. Something happened. 6 people died. Then 72 more. The lessons from Lakanal House are written in blood. And we're still learning them. Slowly. Reluctantly. While people live in buildings that could be the next Lakanal House. The next Grenfell Tower. The only question is whether we'll actually learn the lessons before the next fire. Or whether we'll need another inquest, another coroner's report, another set of unlawful killing verdicts, another round of promises that this time we'll actually fix the problems. History suggests we won't. But maybe, just maybe, enough people will get angry enough that we finally do. Catherine Hickman, 31. Diana Francisquini, 26. Thais Francisquini, 6. Felipe Francisquini, 3. Helena Doarca, 34. Michelle Doarca, 20 days old. Those are the numbers that matter. Not the budget shortfalls. Not the refurbishment costs. Not the political considerations. 6 human beings who should still be alive.